You're listening to the Coach's Journey podcast, exposing the struggles and celebrating the successes in the life of coaches who are action takers and creating authentic impact in today's world. Whether you're just starting out, expanding your reach, or exploding your impact, you're in the right place right now. Stay tuned and be sure to subscribe to this podcast. Now, here are your hosts of the Coach's Journey podcast.
Have you been working with some of the clients that you're working with? Has the economic challenges that have just kind of been ramped up even more recently, have they come to the surface as an issue, or how are you seeing them?
Before I go on my long-winded journey, first of all, yes, it definitely has affected people, whether it's potential clients or those who I'm already working with. But I'm actually curious, before I jump in, I'm actually really curious to hear your take on it from a real estate investor perspective, because I think that will clarify some of the things I'm going to go into, because a lot of my clients are real estate investors. If you step away from the coach, and I know you're connected with investors and the realtors and people who are in the real estate world, like how is this affecting? Because I know there's a big effect in that area.
So great question. I think everybody that's in the real estate space kind of has a different concern or a different fear, a different way of responding, and I think a different way that they need to think about things. So as an investor, if I'm working on buying stuff, which I'm always kind of actively looking, my concerns and what I focus on, I think would be very different than somebody that's already bought in, because I know that there are a lot of investors who have purchased properties over the past few years on adjustable rate loans, ones that adjust. That is honestly where I see the biggest amount of justified fear residing in the real estate industry, because just to kind of break it down quickly, you buy a property, it's cash flowing, but what happens then is your rate can adjust if you have that kind of mortgage. And then all of a sudden, the expenses and the income stay the same with the exception of your amount of interest. And so that some of the increases that people could experience from that alone could kick it out of being cash flowing. And then if you have a bigger property and then you've got other investors involved, now you have a cluster, because you might be losing money, and not only losing your own money, but losing other people's money. So there's a real significant concern in that space of the decisions that have already been made. And now kind of these unexpected changes impact, versus somebody that hasn't bought and they're wanting to wait and see, or they're like, well, it's a big interest rate, just because they're used to what the interest rate used to be. So my long-winded answer is it really depends on where you are in the real estate cycle of life.
Yeah, I love how logically you looked at that whole process. That is not the sense that I get when I'm talking to investors.
Yeah,
because what you described was very my concern. The concern was very logical and rational, in the sense that, hey, if these things go down, then that's going to affect people, and I would be concerned about it. And that's a legitimate concern, because it's actually. And just to break this down for everybody, if you haven't thought about this actually affects other people who are, for example, who have mortgages as well. So we're not just talking about the real estate investing space. We're people who have mortgages at variable rates, and you called it, what did you call it?
adjustable or variable.
Adjustable variable. And not only them, but people who have been on a fixed rate and they're up for renewal soon. And there's a prediction that they're talking about, at least in Canada, that's where a lot of foreclosure of people selling their houses. I mean, that's creating a challenge. And also on the other side of it, jobs are a big problem. So I was sharing that with Sherry. I talked to a potential client the other day who works at one of the big companies. I won't reveal it because it will make it obvious. But a big computer company, and they have been laying off people since last year, at mass, 13,000 people last year. And now they went through another wave of it. Partly there's adjustment to technology that's coming around, but a huge part of it, the companies are concerned too. They don't know if they're going to be able to pay their bills and still gain profit out of it. So I want to kind of get coaches to understand, because it affects people in day-to-day life. So it doesn't even matter if you own a business or not. And on top of that, the commodity costs are skyrocketing pretty much everywhere. Yes. And so little things are adding up, and that something has to give. In reality, something has to give. And when people start to see news such as a big bank like the Silicon Valley Bank going out of business, that freaks people out. And when I paid attention to it, because some of my investor clients, they started posting on LinkedIn and everywhere, I'm like, holy shoot. And you could tell they're freaking out. And then when you look at the conversations, when you talk to them about it, they are freaking out. And I also know a couple of people who had actually money in a couple of these banks, so that actually affect people negatively too. So looking at all this, so as soon as you bring this stuff into the picture, and that's why I asked you, like, what's the real estate take? And every time this has happened, and this is not the only time that has happened. So for example, when the pandemic came into the picture, it was this very similar reaction to the pandemic. And it was because real estate investors at the time, for example, they were like, oh, shoot, what if my tenants are not paying rent? Because there was a huge thing around the rents. And they didn't know if they could pay their investors. They didn't even know if it could sustain it. So a lot of the clients who came to me, it wasn't like a logical problem. They emotionally couldn't deal with it. They didn't know how to handle it from an emotional point of view. They weren't even going to the rational side of it yet. I'm sure they had conversations. They were dealing with their team, but in their own space, they were freaking out. So a lot of their thought space and emotional state was in panic. And they couldn't focus. They didn't know what was going to happen. As soon as we would go into conversations, an interesting thing would come out. As soon as you deal with the emotional side of it, then the rational side starts to emerge. And then they can create a plan around it. And then they can think through what their options are and what are the possible outcomes, which in most cases, a lot of these guys have backups. A lot of these guys have due diligence systems. So some will be affected negatively, but a lot of these guys have a lot of options, but they don't even get to that until they can actually deal with the emotion side. The bad news for them, the good news for coaches, most people don't know how to deal with the emotional side. And that's where, to me, I would say pandemic was a huge hike for my business, for coaching. And when I saw that, I could already tell people are booking more calls with me without me even trying to promote too much. And it's the same similar thing happened at that time. Now, of course, it depends on the demographic that you're focusing on, but it matters that we understand that. And you might think about, well, what are your options? How are you going towards that a lot? But they might not even know how to go towards that. And you might be overriding just like they're overriding. And they don't have the tools, the awareness to dig a little bit deeper and look at the bigger picture and look at how they can mitigate a lot of the challenges and risks and all that stuff as they're moving through it. But before I kind of move forward, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point that when you think about our brain and how it works, there's the logic centers and then there's the emotional centers. When the emotional centers are triggered, it's like a blizzard or a sandstorm. It's like everything is still there and in place, but the wind is blowing and stuff is going, so you can't see it. Or maybe it's like being in a cave, a true cave where there is zero light. Like your hand is right here, but you can't see it because you're so enveloped in your own emotional turmoil and kind of storm. So that has to get dealt with in some way. There has to be some way to kind of figure that out in order for the logic to kind of set in. I think people are usually pretty good, and I am usually pretty good at being logical in some of these situations, but only after the emotional part has been recognized and has been, given space and time to express itself. And then it's like, okay, now I can kind of have a little bit more of a clear head. Like the snowstorm is starting to pass and I can start to see things a half a mile away.
And also it's funny because the entrepreneurs that I've worked with, even though they might not have formal training in dealing with their emotions, or sometimes they haven't gone through a formal coaching process, a lot of these guys have learned because they've dealt with a lot of crazy situations. They've dealt with a lot of these and they go through the turmoil, they go through all the stuff. And then at some point after they freak out, they'll be like, okay, we need to change something. And those entrepreneurs tend to be very good at what they do because they pivot quickly. Like they will still go through the panic and craziness just like everybody else, but their recovery is much faster. Yes. And for coaches who are listening to this, if you're not up to date on the way Dr. Sherry described it, like these are the two conflicting parts of our brain, like the hindbrain, the limbic system, and the prefrontal cortex. Sometimes they go in conflict, and there are reasons behind it. Like if there's an animal coming towards you, you're not going to sit there assess your possibilities. Your body's going to be like, get the fish out of the way, or find a way to fight this animal. If you're a family member, somebody's in danger, you're not going to think and assess options. There are no logic. Like I wouldn't even care if for example, if I'm crossing the road and my daughter goes in front of me and there's a car coming, I don't think I would be concerned for even hurting her, because I want her to be alive first. And that's very automatic process. Like, and I'm not assessing options. Like, this happens very automatically. So a lot of people go into that fight, freeze, flight response, and it's consistent. It's not like usually that response is a very temporary response until the danger subsides. The problem is that the danger is not physical in nature. It's not in front of you. It gets amplified in our mind, especially if you're surrounded by other people who are scared as well. And now it's being reinforced socially for you. And a lot of the market conditions, even so, I've been listening to a lot of the lectures around this, around what happens in downturns of economy. It's a mass panic. It becomes even the what do you call it? The Silicon Valley Bank, the way they talk about it is that one person found out and recognized something, sent an email, and everybody panicked. They wanted to pull me out, and they went out of business.
It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, it wouldn't have happened if the panic hadn't been there. One of the goals I think about, or one of the realities is, if myself or a client continues to kind of fester in this environment of anxiety where they're constantly being fed that anxiety, fear, it might actually make the situation worse rather than just feeling bad. It might literally increase the severity of what ends up happening. And so I think that helping somebody work through that and move into their resiliency as a human and more into that logical aspect where they can take action, concerted, specific, intentional action based on the future, based on the present and the future. I think that shift is really, really important.
Yeah, definitely. It's one of those things that we might completely omit, especially if you've worked on this and your normal is that you can recover from this quickly. If that's your norm, you might not even think to get into that, because your norm that's not a big deal. It is a concern. It's not a big deal, but your client might not be going through that. Like, for example, throughout the pandemic, worry became a huge issue. Like it started becoming more of like a recurring thing, more so than normal, because everybody was worrying and it became more reinforced. So for example, in these situations, I would want to check in with my clients. Even if the topic is completely off, I would bring them back. I'll be like, okay, I know there are a lot of things happening and what are your thoughts? And a lot of times they will bring it up. They'll be like, hey, I heard about the news, this and that. I've been thinking about this stuff. They will bring it up. But if they don't bring it up, I would want to bring this up because these are like global level events that affects everybody, just like pandemic affected a lot of people. So throughout the pandemic, I think I had much more conversations about family life than any other time in my coaching, because people were directly dealing with, like, they were more around their family, even though they were far away from other households, but within their household, they were having conflicts with their other family members outside. They didn't know how to navigate that. So it became a very dominant topic. As the pandemic kind of subsided and as they started connecting with each other, that became less of an issue.
You're listening to the Coach's Journey podcast.